Well, tonight as we continue our series on love one another, we're going to look a little bit at the heart of relationships tonight and looking at probably some practical ways that you can live out in your relationships to make them better. Last week we looked at Genesis and we looked at the ultimate picture in Genesis 1, 2 and 3 of Adam and Eve and how before sin they knew each other completely. You know, they saw each other naked, but they felt no shame. There was no guilt. There was no weirdness there for them without sin. But of course, we don't live in that world. We live in Genesis 4 and onwards, where there is sin, where there is brokenness. And that sometimes is hard in relationships to deal with. That there is guilt, there is shame, there is brokenness in our world. But there's also love, there's also acceptance, forgiveness, healing, restoration. So the question is, how do we have relationships that honour God and honour each other and fulfil the need in our lives for companionship? We saw last week that God said to Adam it wasn't good that he was alone. Being known, being loved, being accepted is something that I think all of us are created to feel. And relationships, romantic relationships, are just one aspect of that. But the Bible gives us some wise advice about relationships and how we are to navigate this area of our lives practically. One of the things I see in the Bible is the principle of sowing and reaping, the idea of sowing a crop and then harvesting it later on. If you don't tend it, it'll grow weeds. What you plant will grow and you'll harvest this. This is a principle that lives out in our lives. If we put in the study, the reward, the harvest is good grades, potentially. If we are sowing gossip amongst our friends, we might reap a harvest of infighting or people gossiping about us. If we sow selfishness into our friendships, we'll reap a harvest of self-dependence and probably isolation. There's plenty of things we can sow in our lives. And I think that's good to think about relationships in this context. What we put into a relationship will grow and it will become a harvest for us. As we think about relationships, when I was in high school, this is going back away, but there was something that really stood out to me. So at my school, I went to a Christian school, and one of the rules they had there is that during the year 8, 9 and 10 dances that they hold, the socials, they had year 11 river cruise, year 12 school ball, but in the year 8, 9 and 10 socials and dances, boys and girls weren't allowed to dance together. So there was a teacher, she was a maths teacher, she was from Belgium, so had this really funny accent, and I can't do it, sorry. But she would take her 30 centimetre ruler to the dance. She would go on the dance floor, she just must have had no shame. And she'd go up to everyone and she'd say, hold on, not 30 centimetres, move apart. And she would do that the whole night. It just been so much fun for her. But as a student, I can tell you it was the most stupid thing in the world at the time. Sometimes rules and boundaries can be so ludicrous if we don't understand the point. Now, obviously, I think that teacher probably knew something about physical closeness that she didn't want, she probably didn't communicate very well to the students, the why behind what she was doing. But she still went out and did it, and it just seemed stupid at the time. It's easy to mistake that physical closeness, though, in our relationships for emotional closeness, for shared values, for spiritual closeness, for shared goals. They say love is blind. Well, romantic love pretty much is, if I'm honest. It clouds our judgment in all these areas. And I wonder if this teacher knew this at the time. But that was an interesting picture I had of relationships when I was at school, of the area of physical closeness. So, as we start thinking about that tonight, not too awkwardly, but we're going to throw it open to the tables to discuss And you can go into this as deep or shallowly as you would like. The question I want you to chuck around your table is, how far is too far in a relationship? And so I'm going to give you a few minutes to chat, and then we're going to whiteboard some of the answers. So I encourage you to have a chat about that, have a think about it. Maybe someone's told you something in youth group over the years, whatever it is. It'd be good to chat about it on your table, and then we'll share about that at the end. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. Let's do that now. All right, we might continue those conversations later, but we're going to crack on here tonight. Thinking about this question, how far is too far, is an interesting question, isn't it? Perhaps we've thought about this in our own relationships, and if you're not in a relationship, perhaps it's something to think about moving in. But I think that if we're following Jesus, and I say that because if you're not following Jesus here tonight, there'll be some great principles I think you can take away from tonight. But if you do follow Jesus, there is a call on our lives to live as he lived, and to live a life as he lived. And so what we're talking about tonight really is a call to follow Jesus in the area of relationships in our life. So the question, how far too far? I'm going to throw some of this up on the whiteboard, and I'm interested to know what you discussed in your groups. If someone wants to share something, it doesn't have to be personal, but maybe something that came out of your group, go for it. Who wants to go first? Anybody? Just call it out, I will throw it up. Yes.
For dating, we made our rules before we got too emotionally involved, so they were very clear on the emotions about our.
Okay. Yep.
So we actually said, like, no sex before marriage, no compromises. We have simple rules like no sleep in your bedroom. So real.
All right. Practical stuff. All right, let's write this up. So, doors open. That was good. No sex, that was another one. Was there anything else you mentioned? Yeah, so discussing the boundaries. All right, yep. Yep, that's good. Bear with my messy writing. Perhaps I should have employed someone with neater writing. I'm just going to put talking about it. Talking about expectations, maybe, is that a good word? Yep. Yep. Expectations. There we go. All right. Anything else? Now, Connor, you had a great one, didn't you? You did? Well, you came up with 48 bases. This was... You've worked with it, yep. So 48 bases. What's base? Do you remember what base 1 was? Being in the same room. Yeah, okay. Yep. I'm not going to write all the bases up. So not acknowledging each other. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Just being at church and not talking to each other. That's base 1. So everyone's on base 1. Is that how we start? That's great. Was it base 3 was knowing each other but not looking at each other was base 3, yeah. So there's a great discussion with Connor later on to find out. When we go to Nando's, I want to find out, a little bit more about this base system. But I thought that was classic. Have we got any other practical... I see a hand at the back there. Steve, is it? Yes? Christian partner. All right, so a boundary in dating is being Christian. Great. Yep. Anything else? Yep. 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 Okay, so we've got door stays open and bedroom off limits. Yep, I'm just going to put no bedroom. Cool, that's good. Any other, maybe it was something your parents told you. Is there anything else? This table down the back there hasn't shared anything yet, but if someone wants to, that would be great. I think all these discussions will be very different because we all bring different experiences, different family backgrounds to this discussion. And then text at the back. We haven't heard anything from you guys, but I'm conscious that we should. So I know you don't normally. Yep. Okay. Flaws, did you say? Discuss it. Yep. Yeah. Yep. So open communication. Does that sum it up, Daniel? Great. Cool. That's an interesting list of boundaries, isn't there? Anyone else want to throw something else before we move on? Everyone's cool. Oh, yep, we see a hand. Waving the darkness. Not becoming dependent. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Who knows a couple that's like that? Does anyone know a couple that's like that who just can't do anything independently anymore? Yeah, there's a few of you. Yeah, so what codependence, is that what we're calling it? Is that potentially? I don't know what to write, so can I even spell that? Okay, that's a long... keep self-identity. Identity. Well, this is bad when you do something like this and you're not good at spelling or neat writing. How good's that? Okay, we've got an interesting mix of different boundaries up here, don't we? Let me do something for us. So, when it comes to boundaries, there's 3 different areas, I think, in our life that we can create boundaries for that I think are important to think about. So, especially in relationships and dating, we've got physical boundaries. So some of these are physical. We've got spiritual boundaries. And I would lump in here spiritual boundaries with values, common values, core values, those sort of things. And then our third one's emotional boundaries. And so when it comes to boundaries, you can see that there's actually a good mix of things up here. So we've got some that are physical boundaries, like keeping the doors open, no sex. We've got emotional boundaries, like discussing boundaries, talking about expectations, open communication, keeping self-identity. We've got spiritual boundaries. We've got having a Christian partner. Perhaps talking about expectations could fall into this space with values and things as well. When it comes to values, when it comes to boundaries, sometimes we just focus on the physical boundaries when we think about relationships, but there's actually a bigger perspective here. And it's something that we need to consider when we think about relationships. It's not just physical. There's spiritual, there's emotional boundaries as well. As I was looking at this topic this week, and particularly this question on how far is too far, I did a bit of Googling. And I Googled, how far is too far in a relationship? And I just was interested to know what would come up. Now, we had a few different responses. We had about 3 blocks, about 20 miles. And then we also had things like, thank you, someone got that. Now, some other people said, go as far as you want to. Go as far as you feel safe to. Go as far as you give consent to. Now, those things are really good in and of themselves. But they're a lot about you, aren't they? Now, I summarised a lot of things I read on forums and what people were actually asking this question, and people were giving their own responses of what they thought was the right thing to do. And it really boiled down to those 3 things. Go as far as you want to, go as far as you feel safe to, go as far as you give consent to. It's very you-orientated. It's about you. It's about your needs. It's about your safety. But Jesus brings some interesting comments into this space on relationships and into this space of how far is too far. Now, Jesus spoke in a day to Jewish religious leaders and mainly Jews in Jerusalem. And he says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28. He says, "You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now remember, Jesus is talking to people who knew the 10 Commandments in Jewish religion. One of those is obviously do not covet your neighbour's wife. But Jesus points to something quite profound here in this. He points to the heart of the issue. The rule is good, but it's not all there is. The physical boundary is good, but there's something else going on here, and it's to do with your heart. And the rule is meant to point to a greater purpose, a deeper purpose. So the question of how far too far really sort of misses the point in some ways. Because it leaves me asking, why are we asking this question? Are we wanting to draw a line that we can go anywhere up to that line and we haven't broken a rule? I guess sometimes we just like black and white answers to some of these grey issues of relationships, don't we? But Jesus is pretty clear that his ethical standard is actually not the rule. It's way higher than the rule. It's way higher than us just keeping a set of rules. He's actually deeply concerned, not just by how we act, but by how we think, what's going on in our heart, how we relate to people. He's deeply concerned about that. It's easy to look at things in black and white, but Jesus doesn't just look at those physical things. He goes beyond that, and he points to a person's heart and what is actually affected. Even if we don't cross a line physically, our hearts can still be infected. We could be walking all the way inside the lines, yet miss the whole point of it anyway. Now Jesus says to a woman caught in adultery, he says, "Go and sin no more." And of course Jesus is teaching in a temple, and we'll go through the text. I think I've got it on the screen there. And I'll read it out for us. "Teacher," this is the religious leaders, they said to Jesus, "This woman was caught in the act of adultery." Jesus is in the temple, and they bring this woman up to him. "This woman is caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Now we've just read two things, haven't we? One, Jesus is saying, hang on, this law, you've got to be way better than the law. And then we see this example where Jesus has compassion and doesn't condemn this woman for what she's done. Now Jesus isn't messing around here with fluffy language. No, he says, "Go and sin no more." No, he says bluntly. He says, no, don't go and sin. Don't go back to that place where you were doing that thing. Stay away from it. Don't put yourself in a place of temptation. And of course, he offers her no condemnation either. No judgment. And this is a pattern we must understand from Jesus as well. He calls us to a high ethical standard of how we relate to each other. But he knows that we can't be perfect. He doesn't judge us, yet he calls us forward, back in right relationship with him and with each other. So practically speaking, if you're engaging with some form of physical contact, some form of relationship that you could only describe as foreplay because it leads to something called play, then you might not be crossing a physical line that you've set, but it might actually be stepping across a spiritual line in your heart with what you're doing. And Jesus says, well, go and sin no more. Maybe that thing you've been saying on the phone is actually causing you to think about your partner in a way that's not honouring to them or to God. Jesus says, go and sin no more. It might not be a physical line, but there still might be an issue with our heart, causing us to lust. Because out of our heart flows who we are, our relationships with each other, our relationship with God. If we are thinking, doing, or watching things that are causing our heart to get filled with lustful desires, with impure thinking, it will eventually spill out into our relationships with others around us. Proverbs 27 verse 19 says, as a face is reflected in water, so the heart reflects the real person. If you follow Jesus, Jesus is calling us to live a life where we guard our heart, where we leave stuff behind that's not of him, where we live a life that treats others as he treats us, with love, respect, honour, with no judgment. That includes what we think, what we say, what we do. This flows out of our heart, out of your heart, out of who you are. And as we've looked at some rules, and we looked at why we need these rules, they don't actually solve the problems, do they, in relationships, because of our brokenness. Of course, rules are good because they point towards the heart of the issue. They remind us in times where we actually need reminding because of our broken hearts that are in need of mending, of healing, that fall far short of what Jesus' standard is for our lives. And of course, Ezekiel prophesied hundreds of years before Jesus about what Jesus came to do with our hearts. Ezekiel said, or God says through Ezekiel, and I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you, and I will take out your stony, stubborn heart, and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my spirit in you, that you will follow my decrees and be careful to obey my regulations. And it's in our relationships that often we need our hearts mended. To pick up the pieces of a broken heart that falls far short of what Jesus calls us to. And let God restore us. Let God restore you. To give you again a tender heart, a responsive heart to God's calling on your life. The question is, what does it look like? What does a relationship look like when our hearts are in tune with God? When we keep the heart at the centre of our relationship. And I'll just write it up here. When our heart is healthy, when it's in tune with what God wants for our life, what do our relationships look like around us? Now, Paul takes a really good picture of that to Timothy, a leader in the early church. And Paul says this to Timothy. He says, talk to younger men as you would to your own brothers. Treat older women as you would your mother. And treat younger women with all purity as you would your own sisters. And when we're talking about helpful boundaries in relationships, particularly when I would talk to young people in youth group, perhaps, in high school, I would get them to imagine they're sitting with their boyfriend or girlfriend in front of their parents. Maybe they're having some jam and scones together with them. There's some awkward chit-chat. Maybe it's the first time you meet the parents. What do you say? What do you do in that situation? And I would get them to think, well, what are you doing in that situation? How far would you intend to go in that situation? When you're sitting in front of the parents for the first time, what are you going to do? It's a good picture, isn't it? Perhaps it gives us a good picture of what a respectful relationship looks like that Paul actually points to here. Treat each other as brothers and sisters. And as we know, there's so much to focus on, not just the physical, we're talking about spiritual. How would you treat someone spiritually? How would you connect with someone spiritually if you thought of them as your brother or sister? Now, obviously, I have a few sisters and a brother. Now, our relationship at times is not always good. I'll give you that. When we were growing up, goodness, it's like I had 3 mothers in my house. But, having said that, we had many deep and meaningful conversations over the years, even about relationships. But there was always a level of respect and honour there that sometimes it's easy to forget. So when our heart is in the right spot with God, there's spiritual connections, there's emotional connections, and there's physical connections that we can all look at from the point of view that Paul talks about here, practically speaking, as a brother or sister. I think that's a really practical advice. It helps us to treat each other with the way God sees us, with honour. You're a child of God, a daughter of God, a son of God. And of course, you might hug your brother or sister, but that's a different hug, isn't it? That's not the same hug that we talked about earlier, things that are foreplay that lead to play. That's a different sort of hug. You can kiss someone, and that's a different sort of kiss when you kiss your mum or your dad, isn't it? And so there's ways you can respect people in relationships. There's ways that you can respect those you love. That's not designed to lead somewhere that it's not time for in relationships. Now, I started talking about this principle of sowing and reaping, of what we plant, we will harvest. And I want to bring us back there. Because what you put into a relationship, you will reap a harvest of. If you choose to only focus on one area of your relationship, you might find you struggle. You might find you might be blinded to different things that you didn't see earlier, or that you want to see but you can't. As we said, love is blind. And that is so true. If we awaken love before it's time. There are many different emotional and spiritual needs that we have, as well as physical needs. But Paul calls us to a type of relationship that's balanced, that takes all of these into consideration. If you want a deep friendship with someone, you actually need to take the first step of doing that, of asking questions that go a little bit beneath the surface. If you want a close spiritual connection with somebody, you actually need to take the first step and say, hey, how are you going? How can I pray for you? What can I help you with? And of course, we've talked about the physical. There's ways we can respect each other. There's boundaries we can put in place there.